Welcome to Small Arms Solutions. Today we're looking at a very interesting piece of history. Something that some of you will find interesting, some of you will not. You know, when I look at one of these rifles, I look at each individual piece and I think of a story behind it, because each individual piece had somebody who thought it was a good idea and why they wanted to change it, what it was for, a process of which it was adopted. I look at each of those features on these rifles in that way. And nothing is really more intriguing than the history of the 1913 flat top upper receiver rail. That's something that's been going on for quite some time. It was adopted in 1995, and it became part of the M4 carbine, which is where it was most seen at first, and then it went on to other weapons platforms to where it is today. And those of you who watch my channel notice I don't ever use the term Picatinny rail. Well, today you're going to find out why I don't use the term Picatinny rail. So when we look at this issue, first off, we look at the time frame the M16 was adopted in the 1960s was a time when it was not favorable to have optics. There was no consideration to have optics. And when they did, as you can see here from this XM16E1, you see how unnaturally high your eye has to sit to be able to use an optic. And that leaves your head exposed. It's also extremely uncomfortable. So they wanted to come up with ways that you would be able to have your head in a more normal and more natural position on the stock. So we're going to look at this in three different ways. There's three different areas where the development went into the flat top upper receiver in the 1913 rail. The very, very first was the flat top upper receiver. And we're going to see from our discussion that that came out of Colt in the early 1960s when Colt's Hank Tatro developed a somewhat of a flat top upper receiver, not flat top as we know it today, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. So the first flat top receivers came out in the 1960s, and that was by Colt. The next one was the adventation of a dovetail. Dovetail came out of Weaver in the 1940s by having a interface where you could interlock a set of scope rings with a dovetail, which allows you to mount a optic more to any type of a weapon utilizing that dovetail. Then the third was what we refer to as the standardized dimensions, or the true 1913 rail. And that comes down to the work that was done by Richard Swan of Arms in his work with Picatinny and Colt. And that's the three different areas that we're going to look at. So there was no one stop for any one of these. You had three different stages: flat top receiver, inventing of a dovetail, and then the finalized dimensions. The finalized dimensions was critical, so you would have everything being the same every time. Anybody who used Weaver rails knew no two of them were alike. There was no standardization to them. And that's what the MIL-STD-1913 rail was. It was a standardized rail that could be used on any weapons platform, from a rifle to a machine gun to artillery to wherever you would need to have a dovetail on. So we're going to start with the first generation, the Colt Model 656. Now, as we can see from the photograph, we have a flat top. It's not traditional flat top. Basically, it's the carry handle was removed and everything was moved down. You can still see how you have a fully adjustable rear sight, well, adjustable for windage on the rear, but you do have a couple mounting points to be able to put scope rings on. And this was done as their competition model, back in the 60s. In fact, there are pictures floating around of Rob Roy from Colt demonstrating it. It never went anywhere. There was only a prototype that was made, but that was the first time we saw the flat top on the upper receiver. The next iteration was in 1984 with Colt's Future Weapons Program. And as you can see, Colt went that much further to create a flat top upper receiver, and they used stop notches. As you can see, we have round stop notches on here. And we also have a rear backup sight. I also want to do a call out to our good friend Alex for loaning this to us. This is a very valuable piece of history for as far as the weapons platform goes, well predating the 1913 rail. There's very few of these that were made. And the other thing that we'll see on here is a folding front sight. Now, this folding front sight is even more interesting because you would see this same type of a folding front sight brought back when Colt introduced their SCAR program, their Type A, B, and C SCAR, as well as their 6940, 6940P piston one-piece upper receiver. You saw the same type of a folding rear sight that was used back then, except this one here doesn't have a locking system on it. This is just a flip-up. But as you can see, this is very, very interesting, the way this was done. You have three rounded stop notches, and you have the flat where it would hold down the backup sight. There was a optic mounted, as you can see what it was designed for. You had an optic you could mount on there with QD. It was QD by just having the round nuts, very similar to what we have on the M4. So there was only a few of these that were delivered to the military and never really went anywhere. Again, at this time in the 80s, there wasn't much of an interest in putting optics on a general purpose rifle. Now, the next major program that would come would be the Colt AR Program, or the Advanced Combat Rifle Program, that was put out by the U.S. government as an alternative to the M16 that would give you a better hit probability. And this upper receiver, oddly enough, was chosen for that. Now, the difference was they got rid of the backup sight on the ACR, and they put had a detachable carrying handle, as well as they had an optic that was made by Elcan that would go onto the dovetail upper receiver. So the ACR never went anywhere either. This is one of those programs that several companies put a lot of money into to come up with solutions for. That they found out there was nothing really that much better than the M16A2 to be after the testing was done. But there's something else that's very interesting about this, and I was privy to this story by Mr. Richard Swan. Colt had gone to Richard Swan at ARMS because, again, ARMS' primarily purpose was he designed rail systems, mounting interfaces, and so forth, and he wanted to see what he thought of this. And Uncle Dick, many of us know Dick Swan as Uncle Dick. When he looked at it, he had a couple of very quick concerns. First concern was the round stop notches. The round stop notches under recoil with optics moving back and forth, and the steel rod that's in there, these will be known to wallow out and to become loose. The other thing that he noticed was it was pretty shallow. He took a number 2 sharpened pencil. He was able to push it through the bottom of the stop notch into the receiver. And the Colt engineers who were there, they were shocked to see this. So they had realized that this was not a good idea in construction, nor in the way that the utilization of the round stop notches. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to move even more forward until 1987. In 1987, the Canadian government had decided that they wanted to adopt a mounting interface for all military rifles so that all of their soldiers would be able to use Elcan optical sights. Now, the first country that I really know of to ever use optics for standard infantrymen was Austria, with the adoption of the Steyr AUG. The first country to adopt a rail system, the M16, for a flat-top upper receiver was the Canadians, and they had what they referred to as a Canadian Weaver rail. Now, this is something else where Dick Swan was brought into. He was hired by the Canadian government to work on a rail system for them. Now, this predated the 1913 rail, so the dimensions you see on the Canadian Weaver rail are slightly different from that of the 1913 rail. However, it was adopted by the Canadians as the C7A1, C8A1 series rifles. And as you can see, the Canadians put a backup sight on the front, and they put their Elcan optic on here. But what we have here is an actual Canadian Weaver rail upper receiver. Now, this was sold to other countries as well, Denmark, Norway, and others utilizing the Canadian Weaver rail. So now we're going to look at around 1987-88, where SOCOM was requesting a standard interface for all optics and all accessories. In 1989, Picatinny had asked Dick Swan to go to Colt and to work with them on the development of a standardized rail. He had worked with several engineers that were there, and he had presented them with a set of drawings of a rail and an interface, which had already been in inventory, which he had already made for the U.S. military for other projects, which were basically the identical dimensions to the 1913 rail. So he went to work with Colt on those, and what I have here, which is relatively interesting, is we have here the original drawing of the 1913 rail that was sent from Picatinny to Dick Swan for him to verify these were all correct dimensions of his 1913 rail, which he had signed off on, that they were his dimensions. So when we say Picatinny rail, Picatinny was merely the contracting office. They're the same contracting office who worked the M4 program. Do we call the M4 rifle the Picatinny rifle? No. Do we call the M9 pistol the Picatinny pistol? No. This is the M1913 rail. Picatinny had nothing to do with the design of it. And if you want to go down to who designed it, the actual designer was Richard Swan from Ireland. So Colt had gone to work with Dick Swan. I call him Uncle Dick because he was a friend. That's what we referred to him as Uncle Dick, any of us who knew him. Dick Swan was a very controversial character in the industry. He was a gentleman who had a lot of lawsuits. The man spent a lot of time and a lot of money protecting his patents that he had for his rail interfaces, his throw lever mounts, as well as the way he mounted rails to the barrel nut. Dick was very, very, very aggressive in his patents. Anybody who's designed anything else, they should do anything to protect your intellectual property. Dick Swan worked with Colt on the development of the 1913 rail. Then in August 1990, entered into a licensing agreement with them. The story went, which was very interesting. I found during Black Rifle 2. There was a lot of animosity with Dick Swan and many of the engineers at Colt. They didn't like somebody coming in from the outside. And also Dick's personality sometimes could be relatively abrasive, but there's a lot of people there who did not like them. The finalized drawing for the Colt flat-top upper receiver was presented to me by Dick Swan, which was a Colt drawing which had several names that were written on it. It had Dick's name on there for signing off on it that it was correct, and it had a Colt engineer, his name was Richard Costello's signature on there as well. The interesting thing was when I went to Colt and they pulled that drawing, the drawing was blank. There was no names on it whatsoever. So when the word came that these were Dick Swan's dimensions, people said, no, that's not bull feathers, that's not true. So I got the drawing, and I got with Dick and told him what they were saying, and he presented me with some additional evidence of his work involved with there too, where Colt had sent in a fax mail request for those rail dimensions again, and it was signed by Dick Costello, that engineer. So he presented me with the dates and the times of those faxes, everything going back and forth. So as my research went a little bit further, I contacted Mr. Costello. I said, I understand that you work with Dick Swan on this. He goes, no, that's not true. I said, really? I said, well, your name's on here. He goes, no, that must be forged. And I said, you got to be kidding me. I says, well, if Dick's trying to pull something here, we're going to figure this thing out most directly. I says, on the other side of the wall, I have a former Secret Service document examiner. I'd like you to sign your name for me 3 times, and we'll have her take a look at it. And if she finds this is a forge, there's going to be hell to pay. After I told him that's when he admitted that, no, that was his signature, and due to the political climate at Colt at the time, he did not tell these people that it was, in fact, Dick Swan who those dimensions came from. So I went back to those engineers and told them, what had happened, and they were all shocked. But there was no choice, but this is where that it came from. So the finalized 1913 rails first appeared on the Colt rifles in the 1990s, the Colt Sporter series. The first commercial use of the 1913 rail, this was prior to its adoption, but it was the actual dimensions, was seen on the Colt Sporter Match H-Bar 2. Which was the first flat-top upper receiver that they had. Now, during the development of the XM4 program, the XM4 had A2 rear sights on it. And prior to its adoption as the M4, it got rid of the A2 sights in favor of the 1913 rail. The M4 was the first rifle that would have the 1913 rail as part of it, as the weapons platform. And later on, as you would see here, you would see the adoption of the M16A4 with the 1913 rail dovetails. Now, this would also go on to become a NATO STNAG, or a NATO standard. Basically, the only difference between the 1913 rail of Colt and the STNAG was the STNAG prints were in metric rather than in inches. And over the last, the intervening 20 years or so, the 1913 rail has been seen on everything from rifles, machine guns, pistols, and it has worked out very, very well as a standardized rail system for the entire weapons platform, for optics, for lasers, for flashlights, for vertical pistol grips, whatever you'd want to put on it. It's worked out very well, going from receivers to rail systems to anything that you could possibly imagine. Throughout the time period, there's been a lot of arguments over where that it did come from, but there's no doubt from my research exactly where it came from. And Dick Swan is a very important man. He was a man who had a lot of contributions to the industry, to the U.S. military, and to SOCOM. He had done a lot of work on rail systems. Dick Swan was the first one to come out with a free-floating rail for the M16 weapons platform, his rigid rail platform. And then, of course, the SIR system. The SIR system was prior to the early Reed and Knight RAS systems. He sold a lot of them overseas. His rings, his roll lever mounts, those were utilized by SOCOM. His backup sights, rear sights, were used by that. He came out with a folding front sight base that was excellent. So when you had the sight engaged, you had the regular triangle shape of the front sight, but then when you could fold it up, it would fold up out of the way. He was responsible for so many, many things. He received many, many awards throughout his career. Again, he was an abrasive individual. He was a kind of a gentleman who was brilliant. There's a fair share of arrogance there. If you crossed him, he would come after you. You do not steal his intellectual property. It's as simple as that. And again, any of you guys who design anything, you're going to protect that. But I will say, if he was your friend, he was the most loyal friend you would ever want to have. He had passed a couple years ago, which was a horrible loss to the community. He had a long battle with some health issues. He lost his wife prior to that. He was a very good friend of mine. He was the father of the 1913 rail. He was the father of the final dimensions of the 1913 rail. He didn't develop the flat top upper receiver. He didn't develop the dovetail. His responsibility was for those finalized dimensions that were adopted by both Colt and by Crane, and eventually by the U.S. government, which would find its way onto the M16A4, the M4, M4A1, and all future weapons platforms after that. This is a relatively important piece of history because, again, you guys hear me say all the time, 1913 rail, not Picatinny, and this is why. Because there was a developer of this, there was a designer of this who was responsible, and it wasn't Picatinny Arsenal. It was a very sore topic for many, many years because people had always wanted to challenge, to who actually had done it. But when you look at the drawings, you look at the dates, you look at everything that was presented to me during my research to Black Rifle 2, there's absolutely no question of where it came from. He had worked on rail programs with Canada, as well as many other countries for various different things. So again, we're looking at some more of the nerdy type of information and type of historical, but it's something that I think is really important. You guys use 1913 rails every single day. This gives you an idea of where that came from and the history that goes behind it. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you do, please click like, please subscribe, and even better, share. Thank you.